Hey everybody, today we are diving in and talking about relationships.
Yes, the fun stuff. We're talking a lot about marriages, a little bit about dating and engagement.
Yes, and then seeking God through it all. And so right now, we're gonna go ahead and get into it. Hey everybody, my name is Brittany Kuklinski.
And I'm Lorraine Lopez.
And we are gonna have a fun time talking about relationships.
Yes, all the good stuff, the dating, the engagement, and marriage.
Right. And then even the process of liking people. So let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think people think it's like, right from the get, like, okay, we're going to engage tomorrow. Like they skip the whole step of getting to know someone, friendship.
Let's talk about how different times are too, though, compared to when we were in that season and that process. Like,
Right.
The game of social media has changed it all.
Oh my gosh.
There's the swipe up and the
Swipe
reactions,
left, right?
all that's, yeah, there's all this stuff. And I think it's kind of made it complex. And so, yeah, it's a very different world out there today.
I think the pursuance of that, I mean, compared to back then, it was calling a phone that everyone could answer. And you know when you're talking to a specific somebody, to compare to now, you could talk to... What?
Okay, how about waiting till 7 for the free minutes?
Okay, I wasn't there. I had ultimately unlimited minutes.
I remember seeing that recently. I was saying how millennials had to wait for 7 to get like free unlimited minutes, but then
That's
now we don't
funny.
even call anybody, we just text.
Yeah, that's so true too.
So shout out to the millennials.
I know. I'll take that one. My dad had it. We were under a business plan, so it's probably why I didn't have that feel of it. But yeah, I was saying like the pursuance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had to generally go out of your way.
Yeah.
Call somebody.
Yeah.
I think texting was bare minimum. When can I call you? You know,
Yeah.
and there was such a pursuance then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all you need is a swipe of a thumb.
Yeah.
I mean, how basic can you get with that? So I think we could talk about the pursuance of it. And so you don't really know when someone's really interested in you because it's so easy.
Yeah, I think you always have to have a safeguard, you
True.
know. Oftentimes what happens is that you can easily want to react, especially with all these emojis and stuff. You're like trying to read it, you're trying to understand it. Why did they send me the heart eyes, or why did they send the flames, or whatever?
Yeah.
And so you always have to have that safeguard when you receive something.
Right.
And so you don't want to add too much to the context, but you also don't want to downplay it either.
Exactly.
I think you have to be cautious in what you receive in every conversation you have, because it's so easy to get your emotions involved
Right.
in conversation. And I always
Especially-
think of the show that I really don't watch, but I've heard about it. It's the Catfish show, where these people, they thought they knew who they were, and it turns out they look completely different than what they said. Their life is completely different. And these are people that never had any physical contact, yet they're crying.
Yeah.
They're heartbroken.
Right.
And I remember hearing about this show and thinking, that is proof that you don't always have to be physical to be
Right.
so entangled. And so I
Right.
think when you're receiving something, when you're conversating, you always have to be cautious of your emotions.
Right. And then sometimes on the other side of the spectrum, it could be those that are not even open to relationship or friendship because they're just like all these walls built up. They don't even allow a friendship to take place.
Yeah.
And I think even with that, it's like, of course, you want to have your boundaries and you want to be careful about the friends you let into your life, especially from the opposite sex. Of course, you want to have the healthy relationship, especially in ministry. You have to have that. Like, we can't be like, oh, okay, something that really just a pet peeve of mine is like when it's
Awkward?
what?
Awkward?
Okay, awkward, yes, awkward.
That's mine.
But then too, it's like doing too much. Like sometimes you put a guy in a group chat, so then you need accountability in it. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I get it sometimes if it's late at night, but if you're just texting someone a question, you make it sometimes awkward for the people in the group chat. It's
Yeah.
like, I wasn't even pursuing it like that or seeing it like that, and you're putting people in there like accountability.
Yeah.
So I think even in friendships, but accountability is important. And saying like, hey, this person caught my attention. So what would you say, like, for the person that's from that friend state and a possible, like, I think I like you crush state? What advice would you give them to approaching that?
I think that is the phase, if you would, where you're able to really learn who the person is.
Right.
You learn how they think and what their future plans are, how they operate. You know, it's good to kind of get that perspective. Not that you're like, okay, you got to be there.
Right.
Because the reality is, you're probably not there.
Yeah, right.
And you don't want to have all these expectations and then you're super lacking in those. And so I think it's important to use that season to get to know how they think, what's their goals, what's their vision for life. I'm very goal and vision driven. So I think that's a good phase. I know recently someone kind of, was in that place.
Right.
And so I said, this is the best way to learn about them, to really see who is this person? Where's their heart?
Right.
What are their goals? And does it align with what you feel? Right. And so oftentimes people just want them to either be there or they're like, I will be the one to get them there. Like, no, girl, you're not going to be the one to get them there. And no guy either,
Right.
And so I think you have to be willing to just kind of see like, okay, is this something that, in the future could kind of work out? Like, do we balance each other out? And, not too extreme, but then not too, low either with no standards and just, off of one, which might be the physical attraction or something.
Right, right. I think too, because it's not just a podcast for the girls, for the guys too, I think sometimes maybe because the pursuance of the lack of swipe of a thumb or whatever it may be, what are some ways that you think nowadays, since the shift had happened, that the guy can pursue or make it known, hey, I kind of like you, instead of just the emoji, which probably a lot of people can do easily? How can that be like a known factor? Like, hey, I'm kind of into you, without there being like blurred lines?
Yeah, what I think helps just because of communication is just being that clear. I think it's better to be clear than to kind of hint at it,
right?
Because then she's like, was that or did I misinterpret it? Like, did I, was he not really even trying to go that way, or so I think I would think it's better to just be clear, have that conversation, and then and if you weren't too deep into it emotionally, and they're not interested, then that's okay, because you were just trying to find out, but if you're over here dreaming and thinking and
planning a wedding,
exactly, or even for the guys, just like already making plans, like picturing how it's gonna look, they're gonna be there when I get my license pin or whatever. I don't know what guys do. But it's, if you're not that invested in it, I think you're at a good place to just have that conversation and just find out.
Yeah, that's good. I think something that I talk about a lot is embracing seasons. And there's a season for everything, especially in dating, because dating's fun. And I think what some people do is they cross lines of their seasons. Friendship season should be all the fun stuff.
Yeah.
What's your favorite color? Where do you like to go out to eat at? And it's group settings and it's fun and it's light.
Yeah.
And then when you get to dating, then you get to start really getting to know each other a little bit. How was your upbringing, and et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes you have people in relationship, like a friendship, and they're already giving out pet names. They're talking about, where I want to travel to, which is nice, but on a honeymoon, and it's like, hey, what's going to happen if you're in your friendship state talking about things you'd be talking about in your engagement state? And that's where I think and I believe it gives wiggle room for the enemy. Because you're crossing boundaries, you're crossing lines. When God allows certain seasons in our lives for us to embrace, to get to know people, because sometimes you get in a relationship, it doesn't work out, and that's okay. But if you're in a relationship and you cross boundaries, that's when it gets sticky, and that's when it gets tricky. So what do you have to say about that?
I would say too, you're training your heart the wrong way.
That's true.
You're creating this habit with your heart that you're like, I could get this close and then I move to the next, And it might not be, like we said, it might not be physical. You might not kiss, whatever, all those things, but it could just be allowing your heart to go to a little bit deeper place with someone that you wouldn't with other people. And then it's just this habit, then all of a sudden it's like God wants to bring someone in your life. Well, no wonder you can't find nobody, or no wonder you're at that place, because you've developed this unhealthy habit within your heart of just allowing people to go to a certain extent when really that extent, that depth was never meant for them.
That's good. I think too, especially as women, we're emotional, and I own that. We're just emotional women. That's how God created us, and I love that. But I also think that could really enable us sometimes because we are that. And I think when we get into a friendship, we might like somebody, we might load off on them too much. Oh my God, this is what I've been through my whole life, because we want them to attach with our emotions of our upbringing. We want them to attach with how I'm feeling, and they're not there yet.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, and then we do that, and like you mentioned, we do it with multiple people. And eventually now a lot of people know what we've been through, what we encountered. And then we have a hard time deciphering between the next season with the next person.
Yeah, that's so true, because I remember when we were doing the schematic of my wedding and we were talking about, this is where the wedding party's at, this is where the bride and groom, and I was 21 when I got married, so very young. And I remember, I want to be right by my friends and my husband, you know? And my wedding coordinator was like, nope, from that day forward, that's your best friend. And to this day, we have such a strong friendship because we recognize what we were stepping into.
Right.
And so oftentimes what people want to do is they want the best friend now. They want it when they're dating. They want it, you know, before they're even really going to commit to this forever. And so you miss that. And what happens is now you don't hang out with your friends no more. You don't do these things you used to do. You don't go play basketball, or you don't go do all those other ventures and stuff that you were involved with, because you're so consumed with one individual when it's not the season for that yet.
That's so true.
And so I think that's true, that oftentimes they do go into a season too soon.
Right.
Prematurely, really.
Yeah. And then ultimately you get hurt. Like you said, sometimes people pull out like, oh, I thought we were just friends and I was just being a good friend to you.
Yeah.
And then, as speaking on behalf of women, we get attached to that and we feel like our hearts just scattered a little bit of places everywhere.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. But I think in the beginning, when you're interested in someone, this is advice that was given to me, is to look at the fruits. You know, in certain settings, it's easy to lift your hands. It's easy to read your Bible. It's easy to look like you're praying. But in reality, like, are there fruits of that lifestyle? Are there fruits of things that they're saying to you? If they're sharing their desires, their goals, their drive, their purpose, all those things, is there fruit of that? They can tell you that they want to graduate or be a pastor. Like, are they even in Bethany? Or,
Are they investing in it? Right.
BC? And so you got to look at, is there fruit in what they're sharing? And so if you're interested, make sure you see the fruit. If not, hey, you knew what you were getting.
Right. And I've actually had someone come up to me a while ago, and they're like, oh, I'm talking to someone, I like him, we're actually kind of dating. And she's like, but he wants to be this. She goes, but I don't want that. And I'm like, what's happening here? You know, because you should compliment him. That should be the ultimate goal, is to compliment. Because when you date, I mean, dating is fun, like I mentioned, but ultimately we want to date purposely for marriage, and we want to do it right. But sometimes dating happens and it doesn't always work out. But that's why dating's there. Because we get to figure each other out. You get to find their fruits. You get to find, hey, this is how they do family things, or, you know, we get to figure that out together. But I think sometimes you want so badly to make someone fit into a circle, to fit into a square. Sometimes they can fit, but it's a little bit shoved in there, you know. But it's like, ultimately, what are you trying to do here? When the right time, the right person, they could compliment, and you should compliment them. And especially, like, it's different. Dating in the world is a little bit different. I mean, ultimately, it's like, what's your career like? How much money do you make? Like, you know, okay, cool, run it. But then compared to ministry, you got to make sure that call has to be aligned. And what do you say about that? What do you say about the girl that's goo goo gaga over this guy? And, you know, but
or the guy over the girl.
Yep, that happens too. And what do you say to that? Like, if ultimately your calling doesn't line up, what do you say? What advice would you give to that one?
I think they have to be honest, honest with what's what they're seeing, because when they're all, you know, caught in the emotion, stirred up, and all that, it's easy to be blinded, or it's easy to psych yourself out.
That's true.
You could psych yourself out and think like, no, that wasn't that. When you know it was, you know that they were trying to explain to you that that is not what they desired. That's not what their future is going to look like. And I could say that, you know, now being married all these years, that I'm grateful that we had that honesty and transparency with each other in the beginning about what we thought our future would look like. So that now we're here, and there's other, you know, fun stuff that marriage brings as far as challenging to grow in your character. There's not this added on, you know, unnecessary fighting or unnecessary disagreements, because we knew what we were stepping into. We didn't try to make it something different than what it
Right.
really was.
Right.
And so you have to be honest and you have to acknowledge that. You cannot ignore that. You cannot ignore when someone's saying that that's not what I desire for my life.
Right.
And if they don't desire that, that's okay. That's for them, but that's
Right.
probably not for you.
Right.
And so you have to be willing to say what matters more, being true to myself and the calling that God has placed on my life,
Yeah.
or this moment of infatuation.
Yeah. And I think dating looks different for everybody. Everyone has a different process. Some are quick, some are fat, take a longer time. But marriage, how long have you been married for now?
It's going to be 13 years.
Oh my God, that's beautiful.
It's like a whole teenager.
That is. And I know for myself, going back to dating my husband Ryan, and I remember even that was different for me. He was like, he had like rules. It was funny. He'd be like, don't talk to me for like 15 minutes after church. Go connect. And I'm like, all right. And, but I knew what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
He was trying to get me to connect, to disciple, because how quickly we get intertwined with like, let's go hang out. Let's plan something.
Yeah.
And so now I've been married for almost 7 years now, half of a teenager. And it's so beautiful, but what are some ways that you feel like you've grown as a woman, as a wife, being married to a minister, but also a leader? What are some ways you talked about your character building? Some ways that you felt?
My marriage has transformed me, honestly. I was so young, and my perception of what marriage was, I think I just had such an emotional understanding of it, and it was so much more. And I thank God that he's able to be in the center of every relationship and through every stage of the process, because in my marriage I was able to receive healing, I was able to receive transformation. And I remember hearing, we were in the back of a Mighty Men of Valor session, and the preacher was talking about how the husband is there to be a part of the healing process of the wife. And I could attest that was my husband for me. There were things that I didn't really realize were there. And it was in our marriage, it was in different settings where he just loved me the way that Christ loves the church. And because of that, I was able to be vulnerable. I was able to be transparent. I was able to humble myself. But one thing that marriage has taught me is that oftentimes pride can look like a sense of protection when really it's self-destruction.
Wow.
And I mean, that is not pride against my husband, but I remember when I was experiencing insecurities, and I could clearly remember, and I'm in a place where I could comfortably talk about this. And I remember, like, gosh, in the beginning of marriage, there's no way you would get me to say this in front of like a public audience. But I had this one insecurity, and I remember it was hindering my marriage.
Wow.
And I remember being at a marriage retreat, and the altar call was happening. And this was the moment that I needed. This was the moment where I was going to be like the woman, touch the hem, and get that instant healing. And what held me back was the insecurity of knowing there's people in this room that aren't really fond of me. And how can I be so vulnerable when they're going to be watching me?
Wow.
And I remember not making the altar call. I remember feeling so in a battle, like, how did I not get that healing that I've been desperately needing?
Wow. Because of that.
Because of that insecurity. And so then I came to a place where my husband just embraced me. I think God was giving him insight on that. And he began to pray over me, and I just began to break. And I began to allow God to go in that deep place and to really just transform that area of my life. And I'm grateful to say that, man, I have a man of God who really seeks the Lord, that in a moment where it could have my healing could have been prolonged, it didn't, because he stepped in. He really stepped in. And so oftentimes we can allow other things to keep us from getting the healing that we need, that ultimately our marriage will benefit from, because of whatever it is. Like mine was, something so shallow now, but at the moment, oh my God, it was so big, huge, to the point that it was going to almost allow me to miss my opportunity of healing. But I share that because oftentimes in our generation, in the world, we love to show the good.
That's true.
I always joke around, like, you're not going to see me going live arguing with my husband. I'm not like, okay, notify the audience, like, notify my followers. We're about to argue, And so because of that, like, it could be almost difficult to be transparent,
That's
to
true.
be honest.
That's true.
And so I think that's something that I've learned to embrace all the more, is just that transparency. Of course, when you're healed and,
Yeah.
you're able to go at that place. But I think honesty and transparency and having those people that you could speak and share with. And I know that we've had that too. I know that we've had, in the beginning, we were only married like a few years and doing ministry. And because of insecurities, I was like, I don't know who we could trust. I don't know who we could share with, like, or what. You have this idea that the enemy kind of plays with. And so he was always like, I could get someone on the phone. I'm like, no, I was like so scared. The enemy really had that fear over me. And so I remember feeling like, well, we could figure this out together, like we could talk this through.
Yeah.
And we were just at a place where we needed to really expose the enemy.
That's good.
And it wasn't sin. It was just, we needed to just know that there has to be this mentorship in our lives, in our marriage, that no area in our lives could we just keep for ourselves.
Right.
And even though we prayed and we sought the Lord, like he wanted a covering over that area. And so I remember my husband, he's like, it got to the point where he's like, he went to go tell. And I remember, like it was yesterday, I always joke about it. I'm like, I felt so betrayed. I was like, how could he? We had an agreement. And
That's funny.
But after that had faded away, within seconds, I felt so relieved. I felt like, thank God he did that.
Yeah.
And the reason I like to share that is because for the most part in relationships, there's always going to be one that is willing to talk about it, that's willing to seek out help. And there's always going to be the other one that for whatever reasons, whatever past experiences, it's going to want you to stay quiet. It's going to want you to keep it to yourselves. And like I said, it's not necessarily sin, but it's that feeling of not wanting to just open up. And there's power in confession.
Yes.
And so because of that, I'm such an advocate for, like, even if they feel like you betrayed them, do it, trust me. Like, I'm so grateful that we have people that could speak into our marriage
because of where you're at today. And I was thinking and reflecting as you were sharing. I grew up in a church home, like a Christian home, I'm sorry. And so I seen church on Sundays. And that was the base of my Christianity. And I think going into and marrying a pastor's kid, a ministry's kid, it was so hard for me. And like the beginning of yours, my thing was I wanted it to look how my parents' marriage looked when I was growing up. And I wasn't going to get that. And I was fighting tooth and nail because I'm like, but that's what I wanted. That's what I seen. And I think what I had to do was not only expose it, and I had to like be able to convey it, because I didn't understand. Now I understand what it was. It was me growing in ministry and so what. But I had a hard time with that. And it was something so minimal, but for so many things, like on birthdays, on holidays, on weekends, I was having a hard time because I was used to seeing marriage in some type of way. And I think that was something that was big, because I had to stop, take a step aside, and look at my husband's upbringing and say, okay, how was that done? How are we going to raise our daughter? Now I'm looking at that. How can we be intentional with that? And I think marriage really does bring so much out of you, but it grows you and it shines you. And I know ultimately, I say this a lot. I say that I don't ever want to be the reason my husband's held back. I think you're the same way. We don't ever want to be the reason our husband's held back from someone calling on him. I never want to be the reason why, maybe not him. I know Sister Georgina spoke a message and she was like, are you a but his wife? Oh, he's amazing. He's a great preacher. He's willing, but his wife, I don't know. But are you a and his wife? Like, he's amazing, but and his wife? Great. She's dependable. And I think that's something that I've always held dear to my heart. And so I've always been open. I know I didn't come to the marriage complete. I mean, complete in Christ, yes, made whole in him, but I'm not the perfect wife. I strive to be. I want to be the perfect wife for my husband, perfect mother. And I think that's what marriage does to us.
Yeah. I think that's an important point there, because it could look like that, or it could look like, well, I'm going to go back home.
Yeah. Get my
and
bags
some
ready.
people kind of go back home, not completely where they're staying the night there, but they're always around their home.
Yeah.
And the Bible clearly says that they must leave their mother and father and cling to one another. And in that clinging, you are forming together, you are meshing together,
Right.
you are intertwining. And so that's something that is not done overnight. Like it's a process, it's
Right.
an unfolding. The different seasons
Right.
require it to continue to change. And so from just you two to then now you have a family, or
Right.
now you have different roles, or
Right.
I know the season we find ourselves in with my husband in this entrepreneurship. Just the other day, I'm like, I have this huge paper I need to do. And he's like, he's on the phone handling all these crazy business stuff. And he's like, you want to go for a drive? I'm like, yeah. I didn't want to go for a drive, but I did want to go to a drive.
Right.
And I had to recognize in this moment, I am being this support.
Right.
You know, this
Right.
is where we're colliding our worlds.
Right.
I'm the student. He's the entrepreneur. And we have to learn how to mesh together and not say, this is how life is going to be because of my goals, my dreams, my desires, my, you know, all that.
Yeah.
And the way I'm wired, you know, I'm
Right.
wired that I have to do it like this. No, it's
Right.
like we come together and we look to support in the moments,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's not moments, sometimes it's something larger. And so really learning to come together. But another quote, you know, my husband often shares is that marriage doesn't create problems, it reveals them.
Yeah.
And not to scare the people that are not married, but I'm just saying that oftentimes we have this perspective that it's the other person.
Yeah.
It's not me, it's them, you know. I would do better if they would change,
If
you know. And so it's not that, it's that God is using this relationship like he uses every other relationship to grow us, to mature us, to transform us, to make us more like him.
Right.
And I think that's also the beauty in marriage, is that, wow, we get to be a part of helping our spouse become transformed right before our eyes. Like we get to see what others don't see. We
Right.
get to see the unfolding. We get to see the growth. That we get to see what nobody else does. And that's where it goes back to, like you said earlier, how we can't enter into seasons prematurely.
Right.
Save what's necessary for marriage.
Right.
Save what's necessary for the engagement. Save
Right.
what's necessary for each season so that you can value them, you can appreciate them, and you can enjoy them and even learn from them.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think even in all steps of the way, I think we hit on, without really drilling, is communication. Clear communication in everything. And I think from friendship to dating to engagement to marriage, communication is so key. However, so many times, even for myself, I can say is I'm like, but I said that. And he's like, no, you didn't. And I'm like, oh, but I thought it and I felt it.
Yeah.
But, and
That's good.
that messes with us because we're holding on to something without even fully communicating it. And it goes both ways for men as well. Because sometimes I'm like, I know my husband has a lot of hats he wears, and I could see it. I think because I'm so close to him, I can see when he has a lot going on, and so I try to ask him, how can I help you? Whether it be just helping him list out his responsibilities, or it be running an errand for him, or whatever it can be. I know first and foremost, as a wife, I want to help him.
Yeah.
And that does sometimes require putting off something I want to do for myself, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Because ultimately I want to serve him because I know he's serving others. And as I do that, I'm serving God's people as well.
Yeah,
And
learning their love language.
Yes.
And
Okay,
not forcing your love language on them. Because
Yes.
people are like, oh, but they're not appreciating this and that. But maybe that's not their love language.
Exactly.
And I love how in that book it talks about, it's almost like they speak a different language and you're forcing them to speak something that they don't. So
Even with two, I believe, I'm not sure if that book mentions that, but I think you give love one way and you receive it another way. Is that right? Or I don't know.
remember. It's been a while, but
Okay.
I know that I'm a little like that.
Okay, I'm like that because I feel like the way I want to give love is, I think, like gifts and like small mementos. I love writing little notes, like, you know, my husband's like, you're cute, you know, just, I like it, you know, but for me, don't write me stuff like that. Like I cringe at that. I don't want to hear it. For me, I'm just like, you know, different. So I feel like everyone's different. And I think it's understand how you give it, and then how they receive it and vice versa.
Being willing to learn it, being willing to learn the individual and not just, you know, so consumed with self. And that's where it is a challenge because today's society, it's all about you. It's all about looking at what your wants are, your needs are.
Exactly.
The women today can propose. They can be the one to, you know, do all these things that, you know, men should really be doing. And I think just in that, as you're in a pursuit or in any stage of a relationship, you should always look to God's word, always look to the guidance of God, the examples there, because culture is constantly, even down to imagery, but we won't go there. But in everything that they do, they're trying to be intentional into distorting and destroying what God has intended in his word. And so we have to be cautious of what we see, what we hear, what we listen to, that it's not steering us in another direction, but we're always realigning ourselves with God's word to make sure that that's leading us and that's guiding us in our decisions. Is there a principle, is there a value that I'm missing in this season of getting to know someone? Or, and if we're going to transition into a different season of it, going a little bit more deeper, am I still keeping the main thing?
Right.
Because that can never change.
Yeah. And I think as we're wrapping up, I think social media, I think you mentioned, you tapped on it earlier about how we're not going to go live about an argument with our spouse or so be it. But even with down to dating, I think social media has a big role on that. And we want things to look a certain way. And I think sometimes we get into a place of comparison. Their marriage does this and they do that. And so how can we guard ourselves as wives or dating, not to compare? Because it happens so easily. Even, even many mature women could accidentally do that and like to catch yourself. But how can we stay away from comparison? Because social media is kind of like shoving things down our throats sometimes. Very influential, which that's what it's meant to be, there for influence. But the way in our day and age, it influences kind of negatively. How can we be careful as women, could we speak on behalf of the women, of what we compare to and what we digest? Because I know you said compared to the word of God and make sure it's filled with the love of God. But how can we just guard ourselves?
Yeah, I think for the married woman and even for the married man, I would say really have that understanding together of what your values are as a home. Everybody has biblical principles, biblical guidance.
Right.
However, the values could be different according to what God has for your life. Maybe God has called you to the business world. Maybe God has called you to another profession. Maybe God has called you to lead and senior pastor at church. Whatever it is that God has called your family, it's going to require certain values. It's going to require certain budgets. It's going to require certain time management. The pace of your life is not going to look like everybody else's.
Right.
But if you both have that understanding and constantly remind yourselves that this is what we're in pursuit of, I believe that it will help you to stay focused on your main thing.
Yes.
What God is leading you to do.
Yes.
Because if you look at somebody else's, well, there's a lot we don't know.
Right.
Even sometimes when I post, I'm like, but you guys don't understand the struggle I went through before I got to this, one post, know? And so I think it's being willing to take a step back and consider, hey, there's a lot I don't know. Yes. There's a lot I don't know. And there's also a lot that I'm not pursuing. Right. So if I'm going to compare myself with that one post, then I got to compare my whole life. Yeah. And that's going to be inconsistent of what God has for us. Right. And so I think when you have that common understanding and that common vision of what God is doing for your personal, household, then you can just realign yourself like we do with God's word, realign ourselves. And so have that conversation with your spouse, and if you haven't already, take that time, seek out the Lord. I know me and my husband, we like to get away, and we've shared it before in another conversation where when our budget could only afford coffees, that's where we went. We went to go get a coffee and create our vision and stuff. Right. But then we got to a place where we get away and we seek out God. What do you have for this year? What is it you have for our marriage, for our children, for our finances? And so when we see other people post, we're happy for them, but we know that that's not the season for us. Right. And we're okay with it because we hold on to the vision that God has for our lives.
That's so good. I think in dating, in relationships of any sort, friendship, dating boyfriend, girlfriend, to engage, to marriage, there's always something that we can approach in. And I think as we filter it through the word of God and as we filter it for what we have and what God has for our lives, we could take away with a W every time because we know what God called us for and what God has called us to ultimately. And so we just pray that you feel encouraged and maybe insightful on our past experiences, but even on your dating. And it's a God thing. It's a beautiful thing to date. And as long as you do it right and you keep God the center of everything, the center of every conversation, the center of every decision, he will bless it. His word says that he blesses obedience. And as we're obedient unto him, he will bless it. And so we just pray that you feel encouraged and that you really take in, because marriage is a beautiful thing. Yes, it does pull out the negative or the ugly sometimes about ourselves, but ultimately it's to glorify God. Even in marriage, we glorify him. Do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, it's never to stay where we're at, but it's always to take us to a new place. And so whatever process you find yourself at, know that that should be in the intention to go to that new place and what God has for your lives. We hope that you're encouraged by all of this. We know that we're praying for each of you as you're continuing to pursue and what God has for your life, as he brings that person alongside. Know that you have family and you have leaders throughout our ministry that are available just to connect with you and to give you that wisdom when necessary. We hope you enjoyed today.